Hello, everybody. Welcome to another session of the Global Foresight Summit. This year is organized by the APF World Futures Review and Fast Forward. We have now a really interesting group session called Serious Gaming for Transformative Futures. It will be moderated by Tanja, Schindler, and Sweeney. Tanja, welcome. And over to you.
Hello. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Yeah, John and I had a brainstorming and kind of thinking, what are the topics that we want to bring to this conference? And one thing that he and I did primarily over the last years in our communities is talking about serious gaming and using gaming in the futures and foresight field. And today I'm really happy to have 3 people here who invented and kind of using games in the foresight and futures field, also primarily in their lives. And we just really want to have really open conversation. So feel free to drop in any comments and we will shoot them to the panel. And I will shortly hand it to John before we will an introduction round on himself. So to John, to you.
Thanks so much, Tanja. It's really exciting to be here, especially with such an amazing group of people. I think we're at a really interesting and unique moment in futures as a practice, as a way of doing research, as a broad way for talking and thinking, of course, about the future. And I think what's really exciting is that games are becoming just normal. Games are just becoming another tool in the toolbox, and of course they're not the perfect tool, but a really powerful tool. And so part of what we wanted to explore in this conversation was to hear from folks who are using games and creating games and applying games, and to think about, of course, the benefits, but also think about the constraints and try to have an open conversation. And so just to resonate with what Tanja had said, we also want it to be an open space as well. So please don't hesitate to put your questions. We would love to make this as interactive and engaging as possible. And so I think really just to kick things off, we would love to invite the panelists to come in to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their practice. We do have some kind of framing questions, but we also want to make it very organic and responsive as well. So would love to have you guys kick things off. So Jennifer, maybe toss it over to you if you want to do a little bit of an intro and maybe talk also a bit to start about games in your futures practice.
Hi. Yeah, that sounds great. I had a feeling you were going to toss me first, and I should have been a little bit more prepared. So, hi, I'm Jen. I'm second generation Chinese Canadian. I was born and raised in Takaranto, or Toronto, as you might colonially know it. Before I begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that the work that I do is not possible without acknowledging the land that I am on. This land is the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and I would like to acknowledge that these nations and many other recorded and unrecorded nations who cared for the land as past, present, and future caretakers of the land, Takaranto, where the trees meet the water and the gathering place. I am a settler on the stolen land of Turtle Island and on a journey of personal reconciliation. I'm also a mama of 2 children, and I'm navigating my responsibility to them and to future generations. And in my work as a foresighter, a designer, a researcher, a facilitator, and a citizen, I really take deep responsibility in honoring what has come before me and what I might leave behind for future generations. And I believe that we need a decolonized approach to this work. And so I bring this mindset with me to the work that I do as the CEO of the Department of Imaginary Affairs. So the Department of Imaginary Affairs is a national nonprofit in Canada. And yes, we are very much a real organization. And no, we are not part of the government. And so we were co-founded in 2015 with this ethos of like, what would it look like if the government ran and policies and programs and services were designed with as much imagination as young people have? And so we really have embedded our work in seeking and collecting and amplifying stories from what we consider new and developing Canadians, so newcomers and youth, because we think that they represent a large population in Canada that are underestimated when it comes to the design of programs and policies and services. And we really can't imagine equitable futures without also including BIPOC leaders in that work. So with that, I'll talk a little bit about the Foresight project that I did that is gaming. So in 2016, for my master's research, I attempted to figure out the perfect moment of when an average citizen could influence policy change. Spoiler alert, I did not find one. The first thing that I learned that was no matter how many times you've been through a policy process, that it's always different from the time before and the time after, and that there are no two processes that are really alike. So there's not really this like magical way in which you can find the gateway to change. But what I did find was that there was a desire to see how policy consultation happens to be different from both internal and external stakeholders, but there was fear around how to do that. Internal stakeholders feared that trying something innovative and risking wasting taxpayers' dollars, or worse yet, looking like they didn't have answers in front of citizens. And external stakeholders feared that while being consulted, that still nothing would really change as a result, and instead you just end up wasting time and often resources, and that this was really an inequitable approach to influencing policy. Both of these realities put the desire to try something new at a standstill. Couple that with the 4-year political cycle that constantly disrupts work or puts progress in holding pattern, this impacted efforts to invest in long-term change. And so I designed a game to simulate an open consultation process where stakeholders have equal access to changing the rules and the goals. And so I've been playtesting that game for about 5 years and continue to refine that facilitation toolkit. That's
great. Thank you. Thank you so much for putting this in. And I wish that we hand it over straight to the next person. Welcome, Leah.
Hi. So my name is Leah Zaidi, and I am the founder of Multiverse Design. I'm also from Toronto, like Jen. So thank you for the land acknowledgement there. My work is centered around systems thinking and science fiction. That weighs heavily in what I do. On the side, I'm also an associate editor for the World Futures Review alongside John, and an international advisor to Citra Fund, which is Finland's endowment for the future. I'm assuming I'm here because I recently put out a game called Decode the Future through the Future Today Institute and under Amy Webb. So that game is now publicly available and is on their website to download. So that was a 3-year process that started with a project for Sick Kids Hospital that was very healthcare oriented. And for the past 3 years, I've had a deck sitting on my desk that had the basic description of what happened during the pandemic. So, with that happening, I thought it was a good idea to actually release something into the public instead of, hoarding that information to myself. So I developed a game, put it out there, and now it's a tool available for everyone.
Amazing. Yeah. Sorry, Tanja, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll just hand it to Shermon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tanja. So let me briefly introduce myself. I'm currently the chair of the Association of Professional Futurists, and also the founder, director, and chief futurist for the Center for Engaged Foresight. It's a strategic innovation hub based in Manila that has been operating globally since 2012, 2013. and been into futures and foresight work ever since. And my background is primarily in political science and public administration and risk management. So let me jump straight away into the game that I've designed and developed together with my colleagues at the Center for Engaged Foresight. In the last 5 to 7 years, I've been working as a risk management country location leaders for companies and corporations like PwC, Accenture, and EY. And what I've learned in the process, as far as risk management is concerned, is that the only way for you to actually map and accentuate the risk embedded in hope, in plans in the future preferred, is by unpacking these hopes and our views of transformation. What I've learned in the process is that lurking within these hopes and transformative futures are risk. This could be emerging risk. It could be a threat as well, because these ideas are new, and they are by nature disruptive, because it attempts to change the system. It attempts to change mental models, mindset, and worldview. And other than the fact that, of course, it's pretty heavily influenced by systems thinking, is the idea that, how might we be able to diversify and make a scenario conversation more inclusive? And that I came up with the idea of testing the scenarios by using scenarios. So I'm going to stop there now. Yeah, this is just an introduction. We can have more conversation about that later on.
Great. Thanks so much, Shermon. So, Tanja, I think we should also say something. Do you want to introduce yourself? I realize we should also say, hey, what are we doing here?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. I'm Tanja. I'm in multiple roles. I'm currently also vice chair of the APF, the founder of the online community Futurispace, and currently leading a new project that's called Stories from 2050, which I just presented earlier today. And I'd say we use gaming specifically in the Futurispace community that I founded. So we hosted a Shermon's game, was called Dream and Disruption. And we also did Stuart Candy's game, The Thing from the Future, which you haven't seen here. And I played it both the former pre-pandemic offline, where we really had kind of different round tables where people would play different games to get introduced to have a conversation about the future. And now, since the pandemic and with the online community, we transformed that game also in the online space. And it really shows for people who've never been introduced into alternative futures or thinking creatively about the future, this gaming environment really helps them to think outside the box. And so I'm super excited to deepen this conversation, hear your learnings and thinking of that. And yeah, to you, John.
Thanks so much, Tanja. Yeah, I think when this idea came up, what I was really excited about was to get this conversation out there, because of course games are becoming more popular. And in my own practice, I've been doing games for about the last 10 years, and board games with big organizations like the United Nations or Red Cross, Red Crescent, now doing games with folks like Interpol, and also using even mobile augmented reality for games. We were using open source stuff back in the day. But really it was driven by this kind of question of, well, we all get that games are great because they're fun, and it does open up a space where we can use play as a modality for thinking about the future. But I guess I would love to hear from everyone, what's sort of one of the most surprising things about the game design process, or kind of mashing games and futures together that you've had come out of the experience of developing and creating games that clearly are meant to stimulate really dynamic and creative conversations about the future?
I guess I can start off. Something I've been thinking about recently, because I'm in the process of creating a second game, is that, so foresight is a process expertise unto itself, right? Like everybody thinks about the future, so it's not a content expertise per se, and there's no information from the future. So you can't really have content. Being a futurist or a foresight practitioner is about how you use methodology, the sequencing of everything, the frameworks that come into play, all of that sort of stuff. When you go into game design, future suddenly becomes the content. It's not the process anymore. So you can employ the process in order to figure things out or put the components together, but the game design process is a design process. And so putting those design principles up front and center becomes really critical. And I realized in the game that I created, I didn't do that because I went at it like a futurist. And I went at it with like, well, everybody needs to learn futures, and this is going to help everybody practice, and you're going to all become better at this stuff. But really, the primary function of a game and the design process is to have fun and to entertain people. So it should be something that you really want to sit down and play. And I don't think I created that. Like, as you mentioned, John, I think I created a tool. It's more of a tool. It's a gamified tool that borrows from gaming mechanisms, but not a true game. So that learning has been kind of interesting, and I'm going to use that for the next one.
Yeah, if I may pitch in, my process is that, of course, looking back to, to the experience that I had when I was playing game when I was a kid, right? So just trying to remember the experience of gaming and playing games. And what I learned in the process is that it feels so alive to play games. Now, the question was, how might I be able to translate this aliveness into futures in foresight without necessarily like using the tools and the methods? But by playing this game, we learn how to learn the concepts and get the value and significance and ways of doing scenarios. But of course, the game actually, the game design or the idea of creating a game occurred to me in 2018 at the Asia Pacific Futures Network. Right, I've been playing the thing from the future game when Stuart Kennedy like introduced the idea, but I haven't really had that back then so much interest in gamifying the process of scenario building and other elements of foresight. And then suddenly, a thought came to me like, how might I be able to accentuate a risk thinking and risk management in the way we do scenarios? That was in 2019 before the pandemic. And the idea was like, I tried to unpack the scenarios. It was a process, traditional tools and methods. And then, of course, I got introduced to the game of John, the Global Swarm folks. I participated in the game. I was just observing the structure, the design, the conversation. This is fun. Now I went back to Manila and then started like, okay, let's just try to gamify, scenarios here. And of course, the idea is that I've read the book about anti-fragility by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. And of course, in the way we do foresight actually is that we get to choose the drivers of change, right? We try to narrow that down as much as we could. But then Nassim Nicholas Taleb was accentuating, emphasizing that, hey, there's a play of randomness into things, in the real world, you cannot really organize or choose your drivers, right? For the sake of planning, you can do that. But when it comes to the real world, you don't get to choose your drivers of change because it's pretty complex out there. So that is where I started to like use the digital game tools where you can develop the card and then just put in the element of randomness in the way we, identify the drivers of change. And then I use the hybrid archetype scenario method, to just put context into the scenario building. But then the next question was like, how might I be able to incorporate inclusion and diversity of voices in emerging scenarios? Like, is this a game of anticipation for emergence, or is this a game for anticipating the future? And then I designed the game as something that enables you to anticipate emergence. Beyond the drivers of change, what I learned was that there are leaders and movements that actually change the conditions of change. I haven't seen a tool or methodology that actually incorporates leaders and movements, leaders persona or movements persona that disrupts the drivers of change. But apparently we've seen that it works like that. Scenario does not occur, without a vacuum. There are leaders and movements that influences the way we interpret and execute the drivers of change. And last but not the least, of course, are disruptions. These are planetary types of disruption that are beyond our control, that will definitely change the way we imagine the future, perceive, and develop scenarios.
So I think both of those things sort of lend to what I found surprising. So with the game, I think there's also a spectrum of like game to facilitation tool. And when you say game to government workers around consultation, they get very worried. So we very much had to navigate the like, no, it's a facilitation tool, not a game. Like, don't worry about the rules. There is a facilitator role within the game, so you don't have to like spend a lot of time learning what you need to do ahead of time. So that really sort of navigated the like lingo around using games in this kind of setting. But one of the things that I also noticed was, so in order to move from phase 1 to phase 2 in the game that I designed, there is a winning goal, and that's a winning goal by an individual. So it's a card collecting game. There are trends within the game. You need to collect a certain amount of trends and goals and timelines and all of these foresight lingo pieces in order to move on to the next sort of phase, which is actually the collaborative writing of scenarios. And so what's really interesting is, while we're simulating the idea of open access to changing the rules and the goals, people still, their individual desire to win still sort of like came in ahead of that. And so I was actually playing with a group of people who would identify as social activists, and they literally were like, the game was going on and on and on. And I usually book about 3 hours with people, and they were like, I don't understand why this is taking so long. And I was like, well, it's because y'all keep executing power and disrupting other people from winning. At no point have any of you talked about what would it look like if we worked together just to end the game. And in the end, they were like, we don't like this anymore. We just want to move on. And I was like, okay. So the like, it ends up lending itself to a conversation about the process, but also it like activates, even though you want to step into the game world and you're like, okay, well, I'm going to leave behind my regular role and step into the game world, your individual biases still like come up. And so I think that was really interesting to witness and also to facilitate conversations around.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. This was actually a perfect segue to my next question, which would be, what would be the ingredients you would say you need in order to facilitate or to create a game? Leah mentioned that you use normally some methodology you build on. So what would you say is the difference between running or facilitating a foresight method, and what ingredient is needed to get into gamification?
I'll say when I design facilitation tools quite frequently and like scaffold things. So I feel like there's a lot of that overlaps. You need to scaffold and you need to put in pieces of like, this is how you think it's going to go. And then like mitigate for all the times when it doesn't go the way that you thought it was going to go. I think the hardest part for me from like facilitator to game designer was actually trying to write out how to play the game and how to hand that over to someone else. Because as a facilitator, you tend to really adapt on the fly. And when you're designing a game, you have to hand that over. And while I have actually never seen someone else, I haven't handed it over. I feel like that's part of the shift from facilitator to game designer that I haven't quite navigated that coming over that bridge yet.
I think this is where we potentially get our facilitator, futurist, game designer roles mixed up. When I think about a game, I think it's like a fully contained thing. Like think about like as a kid, as Shermon was talking about, when you get a game and how you play it, it's a contained thing that you should be able to put in front of somebody and they can just take over. It's almost like you're not there anymore. And so if it's not being done that way, are you still playing a game? Like, I don't have an answer to this question. I don't think that's a game anymore, where it can be handed off, or it can't be handed off and you have to have interventions. Unless you're doing something like a role-playing game, which is like LARPing, and there is some sort of storytelling element that allows things to evolve, like Dungeons and Dragons. The game itself should be contained, but even Dungeons and Dragons, you can take that, you can appoint a dungeon master and still hand it over to other people. It's not like you need the inventors of the game in the room facilitating everything as you go along. So maybe this is where we have to think more as designers and less as futurists when we go forward and create new ones.
Yeah, and in addition to that, as far as game design is concerned in facilitation, it's very important that you have to test your product or your game, right? Just test it with your friends, with your networks. Try to get their insights and input on how you might be able to, like, design the game in a way that it becomes more interactive, engaging, fun, and it generates and leads to insights. Of course, games does have a certain structure, but as Leah have said, once people gets in, to the mood zone of playing, that's where the structure becomes irrelevant, right? And that's where facilitation comes in. So for games, structure is essential, perhaps at the initial phase stage, but then definitely when people are having the fun of playing the game, and you see that you're achieving the value of the game, if people generates new stories that hasn't been done before, or storyfied in a way that people are starting to rethink and reimagining things, I think that's where you get the fun part.
Yeah, and I think what I appreciate so much about this conversation is it really affirms, again, a lot of my own experience, but also I think a lot of the conversations that really emerge when we think about, okay, as people who are helping individuals, communities, organizations think about the future, what do we really do? Well, we're really focusing on anticipation as a practice, as a way of being, as a critical aspect of life itself, and of course uncertainty, and those are essential to games, right? I mean, if we knew the outcome of a game, why would we play? If there was no sense of it being an open space or being able to test borders and boundaries, then there would be no point in play. But there's also this idea that Leah and others have mentioned around the open aspect, or the infinite game, right? The idea of play just to keep play going. And I think that really resonates with futures as a practice. And so that's maybe a nice segue before we open it up to questions, is thinking about your own personal practice and where you might like to see futures go. If we turn to maybe games as a metaphor, is there a certain game that you think futures ought to be playing, or a certain way that futures ought to be playing in the world that maybe it's not, or you would like to see it play further with?
It's a really tough question. I mean, we don't want the world to be like Monopoly. I think that's probably something most futurists can agree on. That's not working for us. But in terms of what we want the world to look like, accounting for games, I think it has to be like open world games. Like, I think about some of the stuff that's being developed in video gaming and in VR, these sort of open world explorations where you have the ability to interact with the world and shape the world around you, but then it also shapes you in the process, is probably something we need to think a little bit more about, and even getting away from this idea of non-players, like thinking of other people as non-players, as like secondary characters in our stories, as opposed to, their own people in their own stories. One of the things that I learned from in a conversation with Bree Code, who is the creator of True Love AI, she created a game. She talks a lot about the tend and befriend response. So a lot of games are built on the fight or flight response, which is about the competitive, winning, aggression, that sort of response that kicks in when we feel threatened. There's a different stress response, which is tend and befriend, which is, I'm gonna be friends with this person, I'm gonna bring them in, I'm gonna find commonality, all of that good stuff. So it's a completely different stress response, and we don't often think about that kind of response when we're building and designing things. So that might be something we need to bring in a little bit more.
Yeah, and about the game that perhaps unconsciously might have influenced me, in the process, is that I played a lot of the Civilization game, right? The Civilization 6. If you're playing that game, I think that is a pretty quite comprehensive game that enables you to actually simulate future worlds. So for the Dreams and Disruption, the intent really is about, you learn how to build worlds, alternative future worlds, by playing Dreams and Disruption. But then, of course, it's not just about world building, but it's also trying to learn and navigate ways by which you can build emerging dreams of the future. And on top of that, of course, added into the process is overcoming and transcending disruptions. How might your scenario change or evolve in a situation where you're faced with an ocean system collapse, for example, right? So if you put people in those planetary types of constraints, that a scenario could eventually like evolve, or that people might be able to innovate strategies in the process. Like, for example, let's just say future persona. You have this scenario of a worst case future scenario about the future of cybersecurity. And in that scenario, you have Rebellion 2030. And in your future persona, you have Martin Luther King, let's just say. Now, building on the character of Martin Luther King, how might this guy, or Martin Luther King, develop strategies, policies, and programs, that would perhaps challenge or question, the rebellion scenario that you've created, with the drivers of change that you're faced with. Now, in the event that for example, there is some sort of a cyber terrorism as a planetary type of disruption, as a form of emergent risk, how might this leader or movement, address, this situation? So the game that I did for the Dreams of Disruption is really trying to facilitate a conversation wherein you can simulate, emerging futures. But of course, in the drivers of change, I've also included spirituality, ethics, and morality and values, as that's triggers, for change.
So in the work that I do, what we're constantly trying to do is imagine equitable futures. And I think we're in a moment in time where the conversations that we're asking individuals and organizations and leaders to have is around racism, oppression, power, and the people who often hold that power are pretty comfortable. So having those conversations is not always their priority. And so engaging in a game where you're like, well, we're just playing a game. But in that moment, you actually can see an alternative perspective. You can hold a different position for a moment of time. And hopefully that influences the way you make decisions in the future and can actually shift from your normal view and make that change. And I think that like the game that I've designed, but also in a lot of my work, it's really around talking to people in positions of power and having them just reflect on how did that feel when you didn't have power. Running this playtest with a group of people who work at a policy level, and they were like, that was really confusing. Like there were so many rules and I didn't know where we were going. And I was like, that's interesting because all the rules were literally on the table in front of you, transparent and decided by you. That doesn't happen in the real world. So like, what does policy look like and how do people engage when so much of it is not that transparent and you were still upset and confused and frustrated? So let's talk about that as we start to map out what futures could look like. And so I think really for me, my hope is that whether we do games or we do facilitation tools is that we have the power to shift someone's perspective or thinking about their current reality.
Yeah, I really like that. I think by labeling as a game, you said, Jennifer, sometimes people are a bit afraid of it in a business context, but on the other hand, by especially labeling as a game, it sometimes relieves them to actually think beyond their normal scope, and they kind of try and take on different roles or falling back into patterns, although they were not told to. So, but it's opening up this more open space for discussion and what we as futurists all love to do. So I see we have so far one question from Jeffrey, and he asked that the focus seems to be about analog games. What opportunities are there for immersive digital games exploring futures, and how could they be designed in code in a participatory fashion? So I know, for example, that Shermon, you started as an analog game, but you now transferred it also into digital, right?
Yeah, we're currently working, to set up, build, the digital version of the game, and yeah, we're in the process of doing that, and hopefully it will come out for the next several months. But of course, we've been playing that, in different parts of the world, different agencies, and leadership level, from community to high level folks like ministers as well. And what we've learned is the platform is very crucial and critical, especially that we're playing this game virtually, like using Zoom and the mirror boards and those kinds of platforms that we have. So I think it's very critical and crucial to really build your own platform as far as the game itself. It's a make or break scenario, but analog could also work. Of course, there are advantages. I don't know how might the game change in the process if you make it highly digital, like downloadable, subscription based. I don't know. That is something that we're going to see. But as far as the, the brick and mortar approach, it's been working well for us. But definitely, we need to set up something better.
I think this goes back to the discussion of why we're creating games. For the most part, the reason why we're creating games is to facilitate something that is happening in a participatory context, right? So that's probably why you're seeing more of the analog games being created, because it requires some form of gathering between people and a discussion and a conversation. That's why I think what we're creating is more like tools rather than games, right? So it may translate into a digital sort of context in terms of the mechanics, but designing game for digital and virtual worlds is a whole other thing. And that's something I don't know how many futurists really have the skill set to be able to transfer into that medium. I think you need somebody who is a proper game designer in that specific medium, who is also then a futurist or working actively with futurists to develop something like that. I don't know if that's something that any futurist other than Jane McGonigal at this point could pick up and go do. So it's designing for analog versus digital, and designing for digital are just completely different things. And then designing for virtual worlds, like where we're getting into the stuff like VR and proper gaming, is like, that's a whole other level as well. So I think it's just, that's a Jane McGonigal question, probably the last question.
I think that also brings up a question of, like, to Leah's point around why did we design it? It's also who did we design it for? Because often in my setting, we're doing it in nonprofit settings where it's like a thing that's added on to a project that we didn't even originally propose to the funder, because how would you have known you would have ended up there? So the play testing, the ability to actually implement is so short and tiny that we're doing it off the sides of our desks for a really, really long time. And so being able to shift into the digital, and you can do it in lots of like hack job ways. Like I've recently play tested a game using Jamboard, just so that we can get it into that digital space. But is that actually what we would have done had we not had to do it digitally? But I also think that like the access part is really important to think about, like who gains access when we hold it in spaces where we're inviting people to play, and where does the access shift if we can do it digitally? So I think it's, for me, that question is less about how do we make them digital, but what happens if we do?
Yeah, in fact, that's a good point, which leads me to the question too, that about choosing the analog approach or the digital, because sometimes you have different clients and audience, right? And as much as possible, the game has to be customizable, right? Depending on the project that you get, like the drivers have changed, you have to change it depending on the context and why you want them to play this, and then it generates some strategies in the process. So I think the analog approach is pretty much easier to customize rather than, I don't know, I don't have the digital version yet, but definitely that would be more expensive and might be difficult to unless, you develop the back end that enables you to, customize it.
I'll add there just because it is part of a constraint in the tools that are available to us as well. How do you go and translate the physical analog artifact into a digital one? I tried to do that with Decode, and I went into Steam and set up Tabletop Simulator, only to basically learn that you can't sell a game or share a game publicly if it's on Tabletop Simulator. You're essentially just creating it for yourself, because the copyright issues that would emerge from people creating their own games is so insane that Steam can't manage that on behalf of anybody else. So I had to shut that down very quickly, because I realized this is not a forum I can use, which would then essentially mean developing a full-on game that could go up on Steam, not through Tabletop Simulator, but through proper game development. So this is why there's a little bit of a challenge here, like to Sherman's point earlier about you need to find a platform, and that becomes really critical. There's a whole other set of design considerations there.
Yeah, what I really like about this conversation, which is feeling a bit like an intervention, I have to say I feel seen. This point around because my own approach is beg, borrow, and steal, and I have no formal training in game design, and have figured out how to piece stuff together. And as Leah has mentioned, there's few people who have this kind of headspace to be able to talk in these different ways. I will say that. Getting a PlayStation and forcing myself to hurt my thumbs really opened up new ways for thinking about interactions and incentives and how to bring that to Futurist processes. And on that point, we have a really interesting question from Terry. What if games cross over just from being a space of play into really being reality? So the game that you play is not about decision making, but it's actually like the decision. It's the point of decision in the game itself. I think that's a really interesting proposition. So the idea is, of course, that the game itself becomes the medium for the decision, not a simulation in that sense. So would love to open up that question to the group.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of games played by crisis managers and the business continuity analysts playing games, and the product is actually the decision itself. Especially in crisis management. That would be something that I would acknowledge. Like after playing the game simulation, for example, you have a 1 day by playing the game or crisis management exercise involving perhaps around 15 sites or 400,000 people at the same time, and then you have crisis managers or the crisis management team making a decision in this close moments, like for example like pandemic. Some organizations have been playing games to anticipate strategies for pandemic preparation. Big companies like Global Organization has been playing pandemic games in the last 5 years. So when the pandemic hit us, they were working from home a month before even the World Health Organization has declared the pandemic. That's how prepared they are. It leads to strategy and budget and of course decision making.
War games and threat casting certainly does that, right? That's the point of playing those games, is to inform strategy and think about how you would respond in different situations. In terms of the games that we've created, like with Decode, the intention is to ideate and think about, from the organization's perspective, what would you create? What would you do? How would you respond in a certain scenario? How do you adapt what you're pulling out of that scenario into a real world thing? And so the intention is partly to build a muscle and partly to generate ideas that can be put into use. So I think that is partly a function of the games that we've created. The intention there is to get people to, in a strategic way, think about strategy and what they're actually creating. All foresight work, I'll just say in general, all foresight work is about strategy. It's like literally in the name, it's strategic foresight. And sometimes futurists get caught up in this idea of I need to paint pretty pictures of the future and it's about the scenarios. And they do these sort of images of the future that have no strategic value, that don't do anything in the world. I've had conversation after conversation recently with people who are disappointed in the foresight work that they've gotten because it's not useful afterwards. The consultant comes in, does something, hands it off, and nobody can do anything with it. The whole point of doing foresight work is to create actionable strategies. So if you're walking away from a project, whether it's having played a game or doing the traditional consulting work, and you haven't produced anything the company can pick up or the organization can pick up and run with the next day, you haven't actually done strategic foresight work. I don't know what you've done. Maybe you've done speculative work, but it's not foresight work. So you have to think through that final piece of what do you get out of it? And if nobody gets anything out of it, what have you actually achieved? I don't know.
So the game that I designed is called Future Happens Here, and it is meant to sort of simulate that idea of if consultation was done in a more collaborative, co-designed, all the trendy words that we like to use when we talk about citizen-led and engaged and all those things. And the idea is that if you get through the 3 hours that hopefully you would have co-written scenarios together, and that you would actually have come up with a list of strategies. And the collective scenario writing, to Leah's point, is or to Sherman's point, it's not necessarily scenarios that are going to blow anyone's minds, but the idea is that you actually have learned what people are currently thinking about within those relationships between those stakeholders, in order to then actually use that to create strategies, to create new ways of thinking and action. And so while it may not be the actual decision moment that you're using the game for, hopefully what it does is inform how you might build principles for how you would make the decision making possible, and to embed those foresight mindsets that not all of our civil servants are privy to. And so it's actually trying to teach, but also model and show that it's in some ways very scary, and in other ways parts that are actually closer to comfort. And so how do you sort of break out of that when decision making around certain things are so risky that maybe you can make a decision that seems really risky when you write it down or say it out loud, but you can kind of play it through.
Yeah, what I find about gaming is that on one hand, when we talked about that it opens up the space to be in the creative, I think sometimes it's also the pitfall of it announcing it in game. When I play a couple of times the Saka games and facilitation, and you give specific roles to people, being the police, the academics, or the workers, in the end, almost every time they shoot themselves, or the police does, because they don't want to break the rules. Because as kids, we somehow, when you play a game, you're not allowed to break the rules. There's a really specific person who always breaks the rules, who must be there. But in general, that's what I found sometimes in game, then they stick to the rules, although the game decision or winning game would be to break the rules. And this comes aligned with the question that Joanne has, is what is the role of fiction maybe in creation? Some of those games can turn to open up the space from getting away from reality. So how will you see that?
Yeah, just a quick point, Tanja. That's a good point about breaking the rules. What I've learned and the insight that came into scenario development when I started, when we started rolling out the Dreams in Disruption, is that scenarios are actually fluid. It's not as if they occur with a borderline, right? It doesn't work like that. That scenarios are actually fluid and evolving. Yes. Now, and if the game enables people to realize that scenarios are actually evolving and fluid, then perhaps you could generate more aha moments or insights that might lead to strategy later on, because decision makers today decide based on insights. The aha moment, this is something that I cannot ignore. Now that I know about it, this is something that I need to talk about on Monday morning.
Yes, excellent. What are some of the other things about rule breaking or fiction in gaming?
So with regards to fiction, fiction can be useful because it allows you to step outside of the everyday and break out of current paradigms. I think that's where it becomes very useful as a tool, because we get caught up in thinking about tomorrow's going to look like today. And it's going to be an extension of today, and people have a really hard time breaking out of that. So if you went back to 2019 and told people that you would be in lockdown for over a year, a lot of people would not have believed that this would have been the reality, right? And this happening is kind of almost given us ammo as futurists to go be remember when this happened and you didn't think it would? There's other things that can happen, right? So fiction can be useful for getting people to break out of their stuck thinking. But the question again is like, where is that line between you're doing fictional work that doesn't produce any value and you're doing stuff that actually has value for the organization or the group that you're working with or whatever. And I like to think of, storytelling and strategy is like a spectrum. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It's not a binary. You can move between those things. So the question is like, again, what are you doing it for? Who's the group that you're working with, and what do they need in order to accomplish, whatever it is that you're working with for them. If you really need to break thinking, then you probably need to push them further than they think they need to be pushed. If they're comfortable playing around and they're comfortable with their imagination going a little bit more wild, then you can focus maybe on the more strategic. But again, it depends on what it is that you're trying to do.
Yeah, Leah, that's a good point. I just realized in the last 5 years to 7 years of designing or participating in scenario-driven simulations in crisis management was that especially in traditional strategic or contingency planning is that the scenarios that they build are pretty quite conservative. It's informed by trends. Apparently, like for example, in the pandemic, even in big organizations, is that they thought pandemic was just local. They haven't thought about a scenario wherein pandemic was hyper global, right? And then the scenarios that they were preparing for was just like 14 days, 15 days, 24 days, as basis for decision making. But apparently now, we're in a pandemic. It's almost 2 years now, and we're heading into 2 years, and we never know when that might, things get back to new normal, as everyone is saying. And I think fiction is pretty really important and significant at this point. The games must enable people to actually just venture into the unknown world, because people are pretty quite conservative, just building on what's occurring now. And I think that's pretty kind of risky.
I think this is something we make a mistake with when we do facilitated exercises, is that we underestimate how difficult it is to actually think about the future, right? Because you're asking people to think about a complex system that looks different, that has different sort of dynamics than your own. And that can be very difficult to do, particularly when you want multiples of those. So asking people to stretch their imagination is not an easy feat. As futurists, we need to spend more time studying the psychology of time, the neuroscience behind all of this stuff, the biology. We are not hardwired for this stuff. There are very real constraints and barriers in place when you're trying to think about the future. And so your job as a facilitator, as a designer, is to think about how you're going to remove all those barriers to engagement so that people can show up and actually do the thing that they want to do. If you can't remove those barriers to engagement, that's where we start to fail as designers.
Yeah, just to lastly add to that, I think the role of fiction is really interesting. I work typically in community and with people who have never heard the word foresight before. So even it's not my goal to teach them this is how you do foresight. It's just to introduce it as a part of okay, we're going to start mapping this out and thinking about it. And it's really more that I'm doing foresight on the back end. What I find really useful about fictions is that people's reaction to a fiction tells you a lot. And so doing that actually to then learn about where people's boundaries are in their imagination and where their risk tolerances are and why they think something is impossible. So I worked with a nonprofit that just at the time when Ontario was starting to legalize cannabis, they were like, well, we already have a landscape social enterprise. What if we started a marijuana company? And they were all like, no, that's ridiculous. And I was like, actually, that's not a bad idea. That could have actually been a really lucrative social enterprise. And no one really talks about the impact of what legalizing marijuana did on marginalized communities and racialized communities. It definitely impacted their economics. It impacted their livelihoods. It impacted criminality of it. There was a major shift there. So there was definitely a role that nonprofits could have been playing in that. And so I think that's where fictions, sometimes it's not about the scenario you leave behind, but the way in which the scenario might probe a new conversation.
So we have a few minutes left, and we have lots of amazing questions, all of which we have no time to answer. And there's Fran. Okay, so that means we're definitely staring down the barrel. So We'll definitely try to put some links into the chat, or sorry, links into the underneath YouTube. But in the 1 minute we have left, I hope we have a minute. I want to know your guilty pleasure game, and I want to know what game you go to because you want to win. So would love to hear that. What's your favorite game? What games do you like to play? Again, non-Futures games. What do you love to play?
Cards Against Humanity, because I think you learn interesting things about people. In Catan, which can get very aggressive.
Yeah, for me, it's Civilization 6. I've been playing it over the years now. I still love Civilization.
I feel like I will say nothing intelligent other than Candy Crush.
Yay for Candy Crush.
For me, playing card games, for me, playing is really like a social and something not to think too much. So kind of like easy rules card games. So playing, that's kind of like getting on. How about you, John?
Fran, you're here, so you have to play. What's your favorite game?
Oh, what's my favorite game? It used to be Age of Empires a long time ago.
Nice. Yeah, I'm a total Catanathon person, so that's what got me into games, and that's what has driven a lot of my work in games. If you've seen any of my games, you see the hex cards, which I totally ripped off from Catan. So just want to say thanks to everyone. It's been an amazing session. We'll put some links underneath. Really appreciate all the questions. Sorry we didn't get to everything. Tanja, over to you for the last word.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we can see this is a conversation we could continue on for forever, but I hope everyone got some glimpse of what is possible and where to use gaming within Futures. And I hope we continue those conversations more often and bring gaming into our lives and practice. So thank you all so much for being here and having this discussion with us. And thank you all for listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.